Seen in other channels, Bill. What channels? Facebook? No.
Facebook and YouTube.
YouTube and
Está. Adelante.
Ok. ¿Hablo yo?
Sí, sí.
Sí. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos, a todas, especialmente a mis colegas Estela, Gustavo, espero que esté Tere Santiago, Ernesto, etcétera, mis estudiantes, por estar hoy aquí. Tengo el honor y el placer de presentar a mi colega, amigo y director honorario del Grupo de Teoría Crítica en Praga, que este año será en Dublín, pero que ahora ya es solamente honorario, ya no está más allí, profesor de la Universidad de Indiana, que como ustedes saben, escribió hace tiempo, está traducido su libro sobre la desobediencia civil. Ahora hablábamos algo de sus intereses, es profesor él de lo que se llama en Estados Unidos Political Science. Él estuvo, por supuesto, varios años en Alemania, entre otros por una beca Humboldt, por una beca Ford, por un German Marshall Fund Research Fellowship. Sus libros tiene, entre otros, muchos, el Cambridge Companion to Civil Disobedience, The End of Law, Carl Schmitt in the 21st Century, The Realist Case for Global Reform, otros muy conocidos, Hans Morgenthau, Realism and Beyond, High Speed Society, Social Acceleration, Power and Modernity, junto con Hartmut Rosa. Muchos artículos que son obviamente muy interesantes, Goodbye to Nonviolence, Political Disobedience and the Climate Emergency, Why Not Uncivil Disobedience, todos estos suenan fantásticos, The Revival of Thoreauvian Resistance, Torture and the New Warfare in Constellations, tiene el de desobediencia civil con nosotros en Signos, el número 32 en el año 2014. Y ahora presentaremos un trabajo que algunos de ustedes ya tienen la copia, el título de la conferencia del Dr. Bill Scheuerman, se llama Politically Motivated Property Damage. Y welcome to Mexico, and hopefully you'll be in person the next lecture you give to us. But very welcome, Bill. Thank you for accepting this invitation, and go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. I apologize that I will have to speak in English. I wish I could speak Spanish. That's unfortunate. And before I begin to talk about the paper, my very special thanks to my friend and my former Prague colleague, Maria Pialara. Maria has been directly involved in my research. I was going to say about a decade, Maria, but it's more like 25 years, going back to the late 90s when we first started going to Prague together. Maria has listened patiently to more of my presentations than I think she would want to admit. Let me just say I'm very, very grateful for all of your insight over the many years, for your support and for your solidarity. So thank you very much. And I'm so happy we're able to continue the conversation, even though we're no longer working together in Prague. The paper that perhaps some of you had a chance to read for today is part of a project that follows up on my previous work on civil disobedience. What I'm now trying to do is take a closer look at militant, politically based lawbreaking that cannot be neatly placed under the rubric of civil disobedience, which of course can be and historically has been understood in many, many different ways. My little book on civil disobedience, which Maria Pia mentioned a moment ago, it's been translated into Spanish, explores some of those differences. What I try to show in the book is that civil disobedience is best understood in terms of a series of competing ideal types. There's a religious spiritual version of civil disobedience. You see this in Gandhi and King. There's a liberal version. You see this in somebody like Rawls, radical democratic or Republican versions, and Habermas and Arendt. And yes, perhaps also an anarchist version, although for reasons I cannot get into right now, those versions tend to be much more problematic, it seems to me. Nonetheless, all of civil disobedience's variants speak what I describe in the book as a common conceptual language. In all of its versions, civil disobedience has been about politically motivated lawbreaking that's supposed to be civil in some sense of that term. Of course, people disagree about what that means. It's supposed to be conscientious, it's supposed to be nonviolent, and it's supposed to be public, of course. It's also supposed to demonstrate what Rawls called fidelity to law, what Dr. King famously called the highest respect for law. You break the law, but you do so in such a way as to show some sort of fundamental respect for the law, which, by the way, is not the same thing as respect for the existing legal order. Of course, many of these figures in history did not support key features of the existing legal systems. And you did this typically, of course, by accepting some sort of legal sanctions. Now, a lot of what we're seeing in recent protest movements no longer can be characterized, it seems to me, as civil disobedience, at least if we understand that term in some reasonably coherent way. I mean, of course, we could redefine it to include everything and anything, but then it's not going to be very useful anymore. Incidents of lawbreaking by Black Lives Matter protesters in the US and elsewhere in the summer of 2020, they were overwhelmingly peaceful. There's no question about this. However, some of those protests did include incidents of arson, looting, and vandalism, as we call these things in English. If you followed recent movements calling for action against climate change, most of the activists who are engaging in this lawbreaking are pursuing, I think, relatively standard models of nonviolent civil disobedience. If you look at what Greta Thunberg has been proposing or Extinction Rebellion, I think this is certainly the case. However, we are seeing growing incidents of environmental sabotage, ecotage, as it's often called. So gas pipelines, for example, get vandalized under the cover of nightfall by protesters who try to hide their identities. One final recent example, there are lots of other ones, of course, we could talk about, and maybe we'll have a chance to do so during the conversation we'll have. If you have followed the truly terrible developments in Hong Kong, among pro-democracy activists there, we clearly can see a shift of sorts. Initially, many of these activists were committed to traditional forms of nonviolent civil disobedience. Increasingly, they came to embrace what the philosopher Candace Delmas describes and has defended as uncivil disobedience. And there are some understandable reasons for this, it seems to me. I'm not criticizing the activists. What's uncivil disobedience? Well, this is political lawbreaking that is covert. It's not public, it's disruptive and often morally offensive, so it's not civil, at least in the usual senses of the term. It's legally evasive. You don't try to show respect for the law. You don't try to accept legal sanctions. And most importantly for my comments today, it's violent, at least in the sense of entailing acts of property damage. That final feature of these recent protests, politically motivated property damage, is what I want to talk about with you tonight. Why is it worth our time to discuss? Well, as I just said, politically based property damage is happening. We have to make sense of it politically and normatively. I have a second, and I would say somewhat more scholarly reason, but I also think it's an important one, obviously. If you go and you look at this massive normative-minded literature on civil disobedience, on political resistance, on whistleblowing, and so on, the question of politically motivated property damage is ubiquitous. It's all over the place, but it's rarely discussed or analyzed in a very systematic way. Everybody is aware of it. Everybody talks about it. There are plenty of references to it. But typically it's marginal, I would say, to the political, theoretical, and philosophical arguments that end up getting formulated. And again, I think for both political and theoretical reasons, we have to try to do better. So let me try to sketch the outlines of the argument. My apologies to those of you who have read the paper. Hopefully I'm not going to repeat too much of what you're already familiar with. The first thing I want to do is push back against recent literature, in particular the work of Candace Delmas and others. I think this is important work, and this is why we have to engage it. They've been offering, as I mentioned, defenses of what they now call uncivil disobedience. To their credit, these authors are providing some normative space for politically motivated property damage. However, I worry that these mostly left-wing authors are implicitly reproducing a problem that we also find in many critical responses to militant lawbreaking that we see coming from more mainstream and frankly more right-wing positions. I'm thinking, for example, of how many political conservatives, and I'm sure this is true in your country, it's certainly true in my country, instinctively describe even the most limited forms of symbolic property damage as acts of horrific violence, right? Destructive mayhem. I mean, if you look at the Fox News coverage of statues and monuments getting torn down, as my daughter said to me at one point, you'd think the vampire apocalypse is upon us. I mean, there's just this level of hysteria, which is really disproportionate. I thought she was right about that. I think she's, this is perfectly accurate. The problem here, I think, is an overly broad, over-inclusive, and in my view, terribly misleading understanding of violence, where violence, without any real justification, as far as I can tell sometimes, refers both to acts harmful to and or destructive of persons and acts destructive or harmful to property. So in other words, there's a conflation between violence against persons and property damage, when in reality, as you know, I think these are very different creatures. A point, by the way, I'll just remind you that you'll find implicit in every modern legal order, right? So we distinguish, of course, in the criminal justice system between murder, manslaughter on the one hand, and things like theft or the destruction of property. We treat one much more punitively than the other. I mean, there are ways in which I think the legal system captures some of these nuances, which we're failing to capture actually in the theoretical debates. Why are these different creatures? Why delineate one from the other? Well, I end up endorsing a relatively limited, and I think more useful notion of violence. I didn't set out to do so. This is something where I really changed my mind as I thought about this. One problem with the broad view we find in somebody like Delmust and in many others is that vandalized window panes and public monuments do not experience discomfort or intense pain in the manner we associate with physical harm to persons, and yes, perhaps other sentient beings as well. Properly understood, violence means subjecting human beings to physical and, yes, extreme psychological pain and damage. Inanimate objects do not experience this sort of violence. Even when property damage can be linked to tangible physical or psychological harm. So think, for example, of a house being burned down, its occupants are homeless, they're traumatized. The relationship between the initiating act and the consequences of that act is typically far less direct and much more complicated than in commonly recognizable cases of physical or psychological violence. For example, when a parent beats a child or a soldier shoots somebody. I worry that broad notions of violence function as confusing stand-ins for a variety of very complicated phenomena. They obstruct a nuanced discussion and nuanced analysis of these different phenomena that alone would allow us to capture some of the vital differences between and among them. So for example, just to flesh this out a little bit, go and take a look again at Johann Galtun's very famous, very influential definition of structural violence, right? I mean, if you look at his definition, he essentially says that violence is present whenever human beings, these are his words, are influenced so as to impede their full development, essentially anything that gets in the way of their self-realization. And guess what? As he proceeds to concede, violence ends up referring to almost every conceivable injustice or inequity we can think of. A lack of education, right? Certain psychological processes we might worry about. We can talk more about this, but I just do not think this is a useful way for us to think about violence. So I think the Australian political theorist John Keane is right when he offers a rather limited definition of violence. Here it is. He says violence should refer to unwanted physical interference by groups and or individuals with the bodies of others, which are consequently made to suffer a series of effects ranging from shock, bruises, scratches, swelling, headaches, broken bones, heart attacks, loss of limbs, even death, all of which, of course, or many of which, of course, are going to be traumatic. So there's also a psychological aspect to this, unavoidably. Broader definitions obscure what's truly terrible about violence, how it violates in deeply traumatic ways the body and the psyche. we extend the concept of violence at the risk, I think, of trivializing what's truly horrible about it. Now, I realize this is not going to be an uncontroversial position. We'll need to argue about this, but it's one I'll be willing to defend. Now, if we simply left the story there, I don't think we would have made a lot of progress. Why not? Well, clearly not all forms of property damage are equivalent. The reason property damage and violence are often conflated is that the former, in some contexts, seems related, maybe in complicated ways, to the latter. So this leads me to the second step of the argument. I argue that we need a more nuanced account of the relationship between violence and property damage. They're not the same, but sometimes, yes, we can identify a special relationship between them. This is where Dr. King comes into my story. I found some of his comments, quite a few of his comments about the massive riots that shook US cities in the mid and late 1960s extremely illuminating. I quoted a few of these in the paper, but he has a lot to say about these riots, and it's a lot of very interesting comments. What I like is that King not only there distinguished violence against persons from property damage, but that he also begins to suggest how and why we might be able to distinguish between and among different types of property damage. So he begins to kind of sketch out an argument I think we might be able to build on. On his view, property should serve to preserve and protect sacred human life. Property is an instrument. It's a means towards an end. Only that end, the human person, is sacrosanct. And of course, there's a religious background here. It's sacrosanct because we're created according to King in God's image. Let me just say, I think we can reconstruct these arguments without the religious background. I mean, I think this is possible. I'm not going to have time to do this, but I do think we can hold on to some of these insights. By implication, property that directly buttresses human beings should possess a privileged position in relation to property that does so only indirectly or perhaps not at all. So I don't think it would have surprised King that we often wince instinctively at politically motivated property damage that seems closely related to tangible injuries to persons. Again, the destruction, let's say, of a small shopkeeper's business, which renders his or her livelihood fragile. Well, we usually are less vexed by property damage unrelated to harm against persons, right? Destroying or defacing a racist or colonialist statue, for example. So I think King was right to suggest that we can and should distinguish between and among different types of property damage, in part by examining their relationships to persons and more specifically, possible violations to persons. Political acts that harm or deface property so as to invite, in more or less direct ways, violations of human beings should clearly be required to pass more demanding normative tests than those that do not. I mean, that's the takeaway in the simplest terms. The next step is I try to apply this insight to some concrete cases. To do so, I felt as though I had to come up with a new sort of typology of property damage. Why? Well, the terms we typically use in English, I mean, I'd be curious if this is true in Spanish, but the ones in English are loaded. They do not invite impartiality. I mean, I talk a little bit about this. They have pretty atrocious genealogy, even rioting referred to sort of inappropriate behavior. You know, this is the original meaning of it going way back. So I offer a typology that instead consists of three ideal typical components: what I'm going to call symbolic property damage, and I'll talk about disruptive property damage, and finally property seizures. So let me say a little bit about each one of these. Let me talk first, of course, about symbolic property damage. So what I want to capture with this category is a subset of protests where legally unauthorized damage to or destruction of property is directed against some target that's been selected primarily because of its symbolic or expressive value. Lots of examples of this, clearly. Here's a recent one. Anti-racist activists in Bristol in the United Kingdom during the summer of 2020, they spray painted and then toppled a statue of Edward Colston, a wealthy philanthropist who profited from the Atlantic slave trade. They did this to show their support for the global anti-racist protests that occurred in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. And by the way, they were recently found not guilty by a jury in the United Kingdom. The criminal charges were dropped. Symbolic property damage represents, I think, the easiest case for us, especially when activists stick relatively close to standard models of civil disobedience. When the acts are communicative, when they're aimed at changing public opinion, for example, when they don't result in any identifiable bodily or psychological violation of persons, the protesters accept legal consequences, at least in principle. Such acts indeed sometimes can be described as civil disobedience. Indeed, some relatively mainstream liberal theorists have done precisely this. So if you go back and look at a fellow by the name of Marshall Cohen, who wrote some very important essays in the late 60s and early 70s on civil disobedience, Rawls relies very heavily on these essays. He very openly said it's perfectly appropriate at times for there to be destruction of public property. If you're doing this in a way to make a message, to send some sort of communicative message to people, and you don't harm anyone. I mean, this can be part of civil disobedience. However, things get messier when symbolic property damage occurs secretly, or when the activists evade any kind of legal consequences. Yet even then, I think it's important to note that their actions may still be legitimately described as nonviolent. The fact that the damaged targets may be public property, monuments, statues, often means that defacing or destroying them doesn't really mean much in terms of the possibility of harm to persons. Even when activists smear graffiti on a privately owned shop or smash a window, the consequences may be onerous, but let's be honest, they're not going to be life-threatening. As I think King correctly suggested, what ultimately should matter in our discussion of these cases is the act's impact on persons. Only if there's some clear bodily or psychological violation should we speak of property damage resulting in violence. Even when these protesters preserve their anonymity, or they fail to provide some sort of public justification for their acts, its basically symbolic character means that they often will still contribute to public debate. Damages to statues and monuments, for example, can be viewed as political counterspeech that targets flawed, hegemonic, or dominant interpretations of history typically favored by state authorities. Defacing or tearing down a monument can make a constructive contribution to political debate, even when I think the protesters ignore elements of the standard civil disobedience playbook. Now, of course, activists can always select the wrong targets. They may fail to impart the desired message. I mean, there's a long history. These are the cases we don't talk about of bad or dumb protests, right? And a lot of this, we focus on the iconic cases. Their causes may be unjust. They might even be stupid. Let's be honest about this. On grounds of political justification or ideology, we might legitimately decide to condemn those acts. I mean, this is true, I would say, of all types of politically motivated lawbreaking. And of course, anyone who opts to engage in property damage will have to pay attention to the possibly counterproductive political consequences. I mean, this is something which worried King. He said most of the time these actions are going to prove politically counterproductive. And I think that's probably true in many cases. Nonetheless, and I think King suggested this, and I think he's right, it is wrong to assert property damage as a priori illegitimacy. There may be a place for it. All right, the second main type I want to talk about is what I call disruptive property damage. This subset, I think, raises some more difficult questions. Illegal acts of this type will typically have symbolic significance, but in addition, and this is why I'm categorizing them differently, they will aim at immediately obstructing practices protesters view as unjust or illegitimate, right? So the targeted property is seen as essential to some disputed practice. This is what we typically call sabotage. So for example, hacktivists who surreptitiously disable the computer servers of large firms or state agencies, disrupting practices they consider unjust. I mean, this is an example of what I have in mind. Much of what's typically called ecotage falls under this rubric. I mentioned this sort of example at the beginning of my comments, right? Climate change activists may try to obstruct the construction of new gas pipelines by destroying equipment at construction sites. Now, these acts are also commonly described as violent, but I would again emphasize there's nothing in principle that gets in the way of their nonviolent nature, at least if we understand violence in the appropriate way. Many of them do not generate or seem related to any harm or injury to any persons. Nonetheless, disruptive property damage sometimes can pave the way in relatively straightforward ways to harm to persons. I mean, this is why things will get more complicated. In these more difficult cases, the boundaries between property damage and violence may become blurred. An example of this, I would say, is tree spiking, right? Where environmental activists will stick a big nail or a big spike in a tree to ward off loggers. This poses some obvious physical threats to the loggers, though, and I think this is an important point to make, not to the owners of the companies who employ them. I mean, too often these protests end up hurting what we call in American English, the small fry, the small guys and gals, right? I mean, not really the big players. And that's something one will have to think very hard about. Politically motivated arson, it seems to me, always seems dangerous for the obvious reason that fires can rage out of control, threatening persons as well as property unrelated to any injustice one might be protesting. I think these dangers suggest that those engaging in disruptive property damage need to pass a relatively demanding set of normative tests. Protesters need to minimize any possible harms to persons. They should always pursue the least harmful conceivable course of actions. Their act should always be, and I'm now quoting a fellow Maria also knows from Prague, Will Smith, who is writing on civil disobedience and is still in Hong Kong, to his credit. These actions, Will says, have to be constrained, proportionate, and discriminated, such that their intended impacts are concentrated as far as possible on the actual wrongdoing. In other words, any sort of collateral damage to property of persons unrelated to these protested injustices has to be avoided. Disruptive property damage is probably most easily justifiable when it's a last resort, when it's defensive in character, when you're warding off some manifest harm or extreme injustice. And you do so in a way so as you only do the minimum necessary to obstruct this injustice. From this perspective, it's nonetheless difficult to justify some recent acts of politically motivated property damage. For example, when Minneapolis anti-racist protesters burned down some immigrant and minority family-owned businesses, I knew some of these owners. I live near them, not that well, it was a while ago, but I used to frequent them. And frankly, I thought a lot about what happened to them. This was the basis for this talk. Their acts had devastating consequences for these people, concrete persons. Some of these acts were assaults on property that clearly supported immigrant families and communities. They could not conceivably, in my view, be justified as part of the battle against systemic racism or racist policing. One would have thought that those fighting racism would have instead made a point of respecting the property of businesses and also nonprofits on which racial and ethnic minorities have directly depended. All right, the last piece in my admittedly somewhat crude typology, what I call property seizures. So what I have in mind here are politically oriented incidents where property is appropriated for one's use. This is different from a disruption that results in property's damage or destruction. And these things, of course, may happen simultaneously. We often see this, but I think it makes sense for conceptual reasons to try to delineate them from one another. Here again, these acts are not necessarily violent. One example, the hacktivist Aaron Swartz. I'm not sure if people are familiar with him. He broke into JSTOR. This, of course, is this electronic collection of journals and scholarly articles that's privately owned now. He did this to make it available to many people who were denied access. He argued, I think quite persuasively, that obsolescent intellectual property laws in the United States had transformed vast troves of knowledge, much of which had been gained by means of public investment, into corporate private property. In a series of public statements, Swartz explained his actions, relentlessly pursued by the FBI on the basis of some truly atrocious laws that we have in the book in the United States. He tragically committed suicide when he was 26. My point, it's very hard to see how Swartz's acts threatened human life or could possibly be construed as violent. Politically based property seizures we might characterize as acts of Robin Hoodism also seem at some junctures justifiable. Here's an example. When the city of Detroit in 1932 slashed unemployment benefits, hungry children responded by snatching food from grocery stores. Their unemployed parents entered chain stores and ordered all the food they possibly could without paying. They walked out without paying. West Virginia coal miners threatened similar property seizures to feed their families. One labor union leader announced, I quote, "No state has a right to call you a criminal if you take what you must have in order to live," end of quote. What I think we can learn from these examples is that politically motivated property seizures may be tragically necessary to prevent avoidable losses of human life, which isn't to say that they're uncomplicated, clearly. Other examples clearly pose more difficult questions. So during the recent anti-racist protests, for example, even many of us, including myself, people who sympathize with these protests, were alarmed by protesters stripping the shelves of retail shops owned by immigrants and racial minorities. Was this a sensible critical reaction? Well, in many cases, I think it was. Many of these businesses, again, directly support human beings who have relied on them for their livelihoods. When protesters ransack them, their actions can have a disastrous existential impact. And this actually is something we saw in some of these incidents. Even if those stealing from the local businesses never sought to harm or endanger anybody, their acts became part of a complex, yet I would suggest traceable chain of events that generated economic distress. And yes, potentially bodily and psychological side effects that are quite negative. Too often, again, it's the small fry, the little guy and the little girl, little gal, we say, right? The small business owners, their families, the employees, not the CEOs, not the stockholders of the national chains who end up paying the highest price. And that's crucial, I think. As in the case of disruptive property damage, these acts have to represent a last resort. They should be constrained, discriminating, and proportionate. Tangible threats to human life always need to be reduced and ideally eliminated. Other protests, I would say, both legal and illegal, including more conventional forms of civil disobedience, should be preferred. There are sound reasons here as well, as with civil disobedience, for protesters to provide some sort of political justification for their acts, at least if they hope to convince anybody that these acts make sense. All right, one final step in my argument. I appreciate your patience. It's difficult this time of the day, and of course, for many of you, this is not your native language. So I've been discussing property damage without any attention. So this is clearly a problem with my argument, without any attention to the question of property rights, or more generally, property's normative justifications. I've just conveniently ignored those sorts of things. Nonetheless, an implicit presupposition of my argument is what gets described in the literature on property as an instrumentalist view. In other words, the idea of property as a means towards an end, as something lacking any intrinsic or essential significance or value. King, on whom I have been relying, clearly presupposed this sort of instrumentalist view, which isn't surprising. He was a social democrat of sorts. As I mentioned, he saw property as serving a higher goal, human life. He denied property the same moral status as human persons. So here's the problem for my argument. What if you do not accept this instrumentalist view? What if you embrace a view of property that attributes some higher normative status to it? What if you see it, for example, as unavoidably connected to autonomy, to freedom, to some notion of human dignity? A lot of different arguments one, of course, can make. On many influential accounts, just think of, here are some names we've all heard: Immanuel Kant, Georg Friedrich Hegel, right? As well as their many disciples. Personhood and property are necessarily linked. Human beings need private property to be autonomous and, in some sense of the term, obviously I'm simplifying, morally self-sufficient. This non-instrumentalist view of property raises some obvious challenges to the argument I've been trying to make. Even when property damage can't be plausibly linked to tangible harms to persons, on this sort of alternative view, there still might be sound reasons for acknowledging the sanctity of property. Damaging or stealing from a privately owned business could then be interpreted as an attack on the individual owner's autonomy or dignity. The distinctions I tried to draw, however porous the borders might have been, between violence against persons and property damage begin to vanish altogether. That's a problem for me. So here's the bad news. I don't have a fully worked out response to this counter-argument, but I do want to end with a little bit of good news. I hope good news. I still think there's one possible way, at least tentatively, we can respond. As Jeremy Waldron has pointed out in this very interesting book that he has written on theories of property, the idea that property owning is necessary, this is how he puts this sort of alternative view, it's necessary for our ethical development. This generally has been interpreted to imply that private ownership should be universal, The widespread disinterest we see in most societies, and these are his words, the moral and material plight of those who own nothing, end of quote, cannot be justified from that perspective. Any idea of property as a fundamental moral good, he points out, I think this is probably right, can be realized politically, institutionally, in many different ways. We can argue about that, of course. Yet it provides, again, this is Waldron's, these are his words, no justification for a society in which some people have lots of property and many have next to none, end of quote. In other words, non-instrumentalist views of property typically suggest the necessity of an egalitarian distribution of property. By implication, this is where I want to end, there still may be some good reasons to allow for some cases of constrained, politically motivated property damage. Under ideal material conditions, property might indeed deserve some more privileged normative status than I've suggested today. But such conditions have clearly not been achieved in our terribly unequal society, certainly not in the United States, and I would assume not in Mexico either. Given the harsh realities of existing property ownership, de facto property systems, it still makes sense to continue to prioritize human persons and their need to survive and yes, flourish, and thus allow for politically motivated property damage as long as it meets some of the conditions that I have tried in a very tentative way to outline. As Dr. King, I think quite rightly would have reminded us, damage or destruction to property often, indeed typically, generates a counterproductive political backlash. I mean, we can't pretend that's not the case. It's not to be undertaken lightly. Strategic and tactical reasons will often militate against it. It can be done, as I already said, for misguided reasons. I mean, you can have all kinds of crazy political causes as a basis for these actions. Nonetheless, there may be circumstances of extreme injustice under which property damage is appropriate and perhaps necessary. I realize that is a somewhat modest conclusion. Hopefully, however, we'll have enough to talk about. I want to thank you for your patience, and of course, I'm looking forward to all of your comments, and especially to your criticisms. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. This is a brilliant account of normativity doing its job on such a difficult question about how upgrading or grading violence versus property. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to raise their questions. So I'm going to open now the debate in case. Hello? Okay, well, if no one comes,
I see
yeah,
Teresa Santiago.
Tere Santiago.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Tere. Tere Santiago, she's a professor also, an expert in violence, by the way.
Oh, good. Okay.
No, I'm not an expert, but okay. Let me see if I can formulate my questions. Thank you very much for your conference, your paper. I think that my question is related with your typology of the different kinds of damage, of property damage. I think that maybe we can use criteria of public damage and private property damage. I think that, for example, when you talk about all of these types of damage is political motivated, but I think that symbolic property damage is clearly public. The target is a public target. The action has a public target, and maybe disruptive property damage is also has a public target. And the last one, the seizing property, has to do with private property, and a very special kind of private property, the one that is in all, or maybe most of our liberal and democratic countries. So it has to do with the kind of property that has society, nation, or something like that. Because there are societies that has more tolerance with the damage to public damage than other kind of society that doesn't has a very much a wide tolerance for the public damage. I don't know if I was clear in my question.
Yeah, I think it's a thank you very much. I think it's a wonderful question, and it's something I've been struggling with. So let me just maybe say why I'm hesitant to draw clear boundaries between public and private property. I do think that in my weird little typology there, one could think of cases, each of them, which would entail either public or private property, you know? And more generally, the argument, and so for example, I mean, if you had a society in which there are racist practices that are being conducted by business owners, one could imagine all kinds of, you know, property damage directed against that kind of private property, right? So I don't think, I mean, I don't think one could draw, I don't think you were suggesting this, but there are people who are saying, well, you know, public property, that's fine. If you go after public property, you can make a statement. And yes, you're right, you know, there are societies that may be more tolerant of this than others, but in general, that's an effective way to make some public statement. But private property is a different matter. And I just don't think that's correct. I think you can think of a lot of examples, right, of private property. Or even, you know, if you could look at the American Civil Rights Movement, I mean, this is interesting. I've been rereading a lot of these, about these canonical movements in light of this more recent work. And what's often forgotten is that a lot of those protests were interpreted as attacks on property. So these famous sit-ins that African-American students did at restaurants and diners, they were prosecuted for trespassing, and they were accused by the property owners, right, of having violated their property rights. And that's actually how the American right wing responded. This is an attack on property. It's not really about civil rights. You know, so there's an example of, you know, a very effective kind of violation of private rights. So I don't know, you know, and then the overall argument I want to make, I mean, there are certainly examples of public property, which if they were damaged, they could be life-threatening as well, right? I mean, if you think about, I just was reading about these horrible events in the Ukraine, the bombing of this hospital in the Ukraine, right? I mean, it's damage to, I mean, it's war, it's not a protest, right? But I assume the hospital's public, maybe it's not. And of course, you're directly endangering people. You know, so I also wouldn't want to say that there's something about public property where we never see a threat to life along the lines that I want. So I think you're right that more work has to be done about the public-private distinction. But I guess maybe this is just my social democratic politics has that. I in principle don't think we should tell a different story about public and private property in terms of the underlying justifications. Okay.
By the way, in your reference to the Ukrainian damage in the war, you used some principles of the laws of war.
Yeah.
Proportional, discrimination, proportionality. Those are the laws of war.
Yeah, you know, and you're right about that. I have to say that bothers me. How's that? That, you know, what I'm doing in those, I'm really glad you noticed this. And here's why, because I read a paper recently and I criticized an author for doing exactly what I'm doing here, saying, why are the laws of war there? And you're right, you know, but I thought about this and I do think, you know, there is something to those laws of war that are relevant when we're thinking about why, you know, we want to minimize harms to people. So even if that's the origin of them, you know, maybe there's a way in which they can be reinterpreted fruitfully. So I've kind of shifted my position on this, frankly. I went from being very skeptical about that kind of discourse for all kinds of reasons to seeing how, because these are cases of law breaking which are conventionally seen as violent, and perhaps there's something we can tap from that legacy to think about that. I don't think I've answered your questions very well, but thank you.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Estela.
Thanks, Maria Pia. Hi, Bill. I really enjoyed your paper and also your lecture now. And I would like to talk about a lot of different things related to those. But I will start with some reflections from the Mexican feminism, because I would like to, I don't know, to put into question maybe the idea of this counterproductive effect of some disruptive destruction of property, because especially for the feminist, not only here and now in Mexico, but you also quote the case of the suffragettes who did a number of things that could be related with property damage. The problem is really different. The feminism public discourse has been always, I don't know the word in English, obliterated by the public in general, by the state, by the main political characters, the main political actors, even by the leftist, the main leftist in the world, not only in Mexico, not only in the United States. So I could argue that for feminism, this kind of political actions that involves destruction of public property, basically of public property, can't be counterproductive. This kind of actions has been indeed exactly the tactics, the new strategic way that lead the movement, the Mexican feminism movement that is very, very young, to a point that couldn't achieve with other political practices. So yes, of course, is a very there is a very, very strong opinion, public opinion against the actions of destroying the public monuments, etc. But they have achieved visibility.
Stella, one second. I just want to clarify to Bill that she's referring not to feminist theories, but of course the activists, the younger groups of activists that year after year in the last like 3 or 4 years have been doing this very exemplar actions against monuments, against buildings, against the president's house, the official house, all right? Not his property, but the official house, as Tere was saying, the official houses in El Zócalo, in Palacio Nacional. That's the kind of thing she was saying. Sorry, Estela, this is just because I couldn't tell Bill about the difference between, you said feminists, but it's the activists, really.
Yes, the movement. Yes, the young activists that are on the street. But this is what's happening nowadays in Mexico City, in all Mexico. But it's not the first time that the movement, that the feminist movement, do this kind of things, and I disagree. In this case, I don't think, for many profound reasons, that it's counterproductive for them.
It's another great question. So another thing here's what I'm struggling with, and I think this is what you're speaking to. So many of these theories, even the most conventional ones, and I do the same thing, is you basically come up with a story, a kind of normative story. So here are some conditions you should meet, right? So here's the analysis of the way in which this is relevant. And then you separate that from matters of prudence, practical politics. So if you go and you look at old John Rawls, the chapter on civil disobedience, he goes and develops this normative account of civil disobedience. I think it's the last paragraph. He says, yes, but even if you may have met these conditions, it could still be the wrong thing to do because you might have a backlash, right? Or you might generate, so now what I like about that is you're recognizing any kind of theoretical account can only do so much, right? I mean, of course, what your theoretical account means on the ground with a particular movement, particular time, it's going to be very difficult to sort of, you don't want a theory you want politics as well as the theoretical analysis. So this is what I like about that approach, and this is why I reproduce that. But what I worry about, and I think this is your worry, is one might read that as, oh, that means if this is going to be too controversial or there's a nasty backlash, you don't do it. And I do think that maybe is a tendency among some of these older liberal theorists. I think they are cautious at times, and maybe they worry too much about the backlash. When we know, I mean, even these movements which have become iconic, like in the United States, that we have this sort of sanitized history of the civil rights movement, which children now grow up with. My kids read Martin Luther King in school. I didn't do that, right? But it's very sanitized. I mean, they miss the ways in which these protests were shocking, and people were outraged by things that we now say, what's the big deal? And I think, I don't want to say that the feminist story is simply the same story, but I do think in some ways there are commonalities. I mean, you don't want everybody agreeing with you. You want to have people upset. That's the whole point of it, right? So I think you're right, but I would wonder. So here's my concern. I still do think there would be a place, let's say, for a feminist or someone sympathetic to feminism to say, nonetheless, some of these protests might be misplaced in the sense they will produce the kind of backlash we really don't want. So one thing is to kind of shock people and inform people. Another thing would be, let's say in New York City, this hasn't happened. I'd love if this happened. We have a statue for Emma Goldman. And, I don't know, some feminists had a crazy day and decided to tear it down, right? I mean, I think we would probably agree, no, this is the wrong message. This would be counterproductive. Or, I mean, that's a silly example. But what I'm trying to say is there would have to be examples also for feminists of when some of these actions would not make sense and would actually produce the kind of result that you wouldn't want, right? But I think you're right. You don't want to. I took this to be the key point. I mean, the emphasis on political repercussions can be very counterproductive. I do think one politically has to think very hard about the kind of repercussions one wants. That even if in other words, the kind of backlash, right? And that's a tough question, it seems to me. And I think your point speaks to a limitation of these theories. It just is not enough discussion of that. The theorists kind of say, well, there's this thing called politics, and you have to worry about that. And we need a richer account of, yeah, of that part of the story, I think.
Gustavo.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very interesting conference, a very interesting paper. I would like to ask a question, and this question is related to your distinction between, on the one side, violence against persons, and on the other side, property damage.
Yeah.
But I think in this case, we need a network of distinctions, because there is the typology of violence is very, very differentiated. I think is violence, for example, only directed against persons, or there is other types of violence directed, for example, against animals, against objects, and so on. And on the other side, on the side of the property, I mean, there is not only a material and objective property, there is also an intangible property, like, I mean, technologies and digital media, social media, and so on. And in this case, I mean, for example, politically motivated hacking against social media, like Facebook or Twitter, and so on, is such an activist against this kind of property, intangible property, is normative to be justified, or is the question in this case of another kind of property, intangible property, a bit different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for a lot of reasons, I think it's a great question. But one reason it's a great question is, in the paper, I have examples of intangible property, hacktivism. But it's also true, now that you say this, it occurs to me that I was actually thinking typically of property in terms of objects. You know, so there is a bit of a disconnect.
Bill, we can't hear you now.
And you don't, do you hear me now?
Now.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm not muted. So who can hear me? Maybe.
Yes, everyone. Yes.
Okay, all right.
I can
Yeah,
hear
so
We
sorry,
do hear you.
Gustavo, it's an excellent question. And what I was beginning to say was, as you spoke, it occurred to me there's a bit of a tension in the paper that I wasn't aware of until you raised this astute question. I mean, I was thinking of examples of intangible property. So hacktivism is one of my examples. But for the most part, I'm thinking of property in a kind of old-fashioned way, you know, in terms of the fundamental distinction I make, which is violence to persons versus property damage, right? And there, I think it's very conventional. So I think you're right. I have to think that through a little bit more. I mean, what I was trying to say was this. So violence against persons is just a very different creature from what we historically talk about in terms of violence versus, I'm talking about inanimate objects, property in that sense, fundamentally, right? I mean, I just think these are very different things. And this isn't just political commentary that confuses this. I mean, if you go and you look at the Oxford, I don't know what your dictionary said, the Oxford English Dictionary even defines property as including both property damage and persons. And I just don't, the more I thought about this, the more I found this problematic. Now, where it gets complicated is, and that's what I'm trying to do in this somewhat simple way, is we have to tell a story about the connection between them. And the more sympathetic reading of broader notions of property than I offered in my quick comments would be to say what these people are really doing. You know, somebody like Zizek, who talks about systemic violence, or Galtoun, this old guy who talks about structural violence, they actually are struggling to talk about the connections between these things. But the mistake they make is they want to stick it all under this one concept of violence in a way that doesn't really allow us to tell the kind of complicated stories we need, you know. But what we clearly do need those kinds of stories, you know. You mentioned something with sentient beings. I do think, I mean, this is complicated, but yes, I do think it probably makes sense to talk about violence in the context of what we're learning about many animals is they have nervous systems like ours. And in my definition of violence, that means they experience violence in some sort of way that's maybe not that different, you know, but that's still very different. I mean, there was, just to give you a silly example, my daughter likes to slam the front door when she came home, and there's now a crack in the glass. Of course, she denies responsibility for this, but I don't think the window experience, I was angry, but the window did not experience, you know, any sort of pain that day. This is just a very different creature. So yeah, that's the, but you're right. I mean, I think intangible property, I need to think more about that and what it might mean. Yeah, thank you.
Roberto. Roberto.
Sí, ahí está.
He seems to have frozen.
Yes, thank you, Professor Bill, for your lecture. I have, see.
Something wrong there.
You could send it in. We don't hear you. You could send it in.
Yeah, perhaps you can write it to us, or I can even translate it if you want to.
No, he had trouble with his connection.
Yeah. Well, meanwhile,
Tu micrófono, María Pía, se te apagó.
Yeah, meanwhile, thank you, Estela. While Roberto tries to connect back to I have some questions of my own. Well, Bill, I'm interested in the idea that, you know, property rights, the case of Store for me is fantastic. Store es, ¿se acuerdan esta cosa de los derechos, no? Porque se dicen Store, pero es JSTOR. Es con lo que compramos los derechos de los artículos.
JSTOR.
This kind of property rights, which is also covers, you know, the music rights, etc. The owner can, of course, claim the self-determination damage to whatever his property rights. But in fact, accepting this kind of thing is more or less destroying the basis of capitalism. And to me, of course, it's an interesting struggle, but this struggle is precisely against property. I mean, in general, it's a more general, it's a stronger claim, or can go into a stronger claim. Interestingly, it can grow without, you know, these are consequences that you don't, well, we don't necessarily know if this can follow up something. This is one, and then the other that came out to me.
Sorry, could you just clarify? I just missed the beginning. This is where the zooming is a problem.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
No, the idea that property rights. I love the example of, well, not love. It's a tragic example, really, of the case that you brought up of this 26-year-old guy who made available to all of us articles that you have to pay with a store, a thing. Well, the owner of store can say it's damaging for my rights of self-determination, but it really is stronger than that. I mean, it is the basis of destruction of capitalism, and I'm totally for this. But I mean, this is why these kind of examples of property damage are close to the hearts of anarchists too, of course, as you can well imagine, right? So this is one thing. And the other is related to what Estela was trying to tell you, and I think that it connects to it indirectly. Because one of the things of your paper, which I thought it was very interesting, is the whole set of things that people have to have on their minds in terms of communication. And Estela referred to the visibility. You know, some of these younger activists are trying to do this violent property damage because of the need to make visible the claims of feminicides and things like that. You know, the government here says that they are conservative, etc. So, but there's another thing that is related to them, because for me, my non being comfortable with them is that they put themselves masks. They you know, I claim that anonymity is not the right way of doing things, precisely because some of the things your paper deals with, that you are also accepting some kind of responsibility with your actions. And this is a very interesting way of connecting it to the idea of communication, because if you want to communicate something, you have to stand your ground, as you say in English.
Yeah, those are great points, Maria. Thanks for that. Thanks again. I mean, as I was saying before, there's so many times in which I've given talks and you've been helpful with things, and you are again. So let me take the last thing. So, you know, I guess I want to agree with you. But here's the problem. This question of what. So I think there are many reasons why these protests, if they're politically serious, right, they need to make a public statement. And so there are conditions of publicity. But where I think it's going to be complicated is what that specifically means, right? So whether or not that always means that people have to show who they are, that I am less sure about than I used to be. And I'll just tell you why. I mean, many of these protests, well, let's go back to Rawls. Rawls talked about civil disobedience, and he said this is the protest form that's suitable to nearly just societies. And then he, interestingly, seems to suggest that even the United States is not a nearly just society, right? So you have these strict conditions in these models of civil disobedience, which were very strict in terms of publicity. And so we've often understood civil disobedience as not allowing for masking as a result. But what if you're living in, like many of our societies that are not very just, and they have authoritarian elements and increasingly repressive elements? Then I'm not so sure that one should demand of protesters in every context that they're unmasked. The crucial thing, you're right, the crucial thing is that they need to make some kind of public statement, and you have to have some sort of way, I would say, typically, in which they own up to things. But I'm just not sure, you know, I'm thinking about these kids in Hong Kong, right, who started wearing masks because the police were going after them. And, you know, I find it problematic to say, well, this is somehow inappropriate, given the specific conditions there, that you have an increasingly repressive state, that there are other ways in which they were owning up to their actions potentially, right? So anyhow, I think the masking issue, I see the problems with this, but I also think it's maybe more complicated again in specific incidents. The other question.
Wait, I just want to say something to relate to this. It's because the president of Mexico, who's supposed to be a very progressive president, calls these people conservatives because he says, no, because he says some people that are not the feminists themselves are really doing the violence, being masked. Right. And so that someone else is taking their place. Is it? And this is the problem. So is it the feminists who are doing this, or are those forces, as he thinks, the neoconservatives against him?
I think you speak to a general issue. I mean, so for example, in this country, Black Lives Matter has a very loose organizational structure. It's not like the old civil rights movement. And so you have these kind of Asian provocateurs who show up and do these crazy things, you know, and that's a real problem. What I'm trying to say is I do think there may be cases in which one can be committed to publicity, even if this seems counterintuitive, and nonetheless there can be masking, you know. I mean, maybe those are rare incidents in most more or less liberal societies, but I do think it's probably possible, you know, but we can talk more about that. Yeah, the other questions also is really interesting, and I struggled with this as I was writing, even though I don't think, well, I do use the category capitalism. I mean, it seems to me there are a lot of different things we could do with what you're saying, right? So I guess I'm not really convinced that even some of these radical protests that I talked about, property seizures, I don't think that's necessarily, I don't think these West Virginia coal miners, for example, I don't think they intended their actions to be a critique of capitalism. Maybe we would have preferred if they had, right? I think they would have been perfectly happy with if it's possible, a form of capitalism that provides them with food, you know? So so this is where it gets complicated again. I'm actually not sure, even though the right wing often says this, right? The right wing in my country will say, well, this is an attack on a free market system, you know, capitalism. A lot of these protests, I think they're actually much more complicated. You know, you have people who are making more specific claims about property. Now, maybe some of those claims point the way beyond capitalism, you know, but I don't think they necessarily have to, you know. But again, I think it would depend. I'm just trying to think of examples. I mean, this is where I was talking about King's comments on these riots. And one of the things he pointed out, which I didn't know and I found fascinating, and I dug around and it turns out this was true, is even in the context of some of the worst looting that took place. So you'd have basically young men, for the most part, go in and they would take color TV sets and so on, right? It turns out a lot of them would return this stuff like a few days later. There'd be an anonymous phone call to the police saying, oh, where can people bring these things back, you know? And so he actually says, this is sort of interesting. It was sort of a symbolic, even that was really just a symbolic protest where these young people are saying, we want to have some sort of part of the American dream, which means you get to own these things, you know? So I think there's a book which I do cite by an anarchist writer who does want to interpret almost any of the kinds of actions that we would place under the rubric of looting, what I call property seizure, as an attack on what she calls white supremacist capitalism. And I just think that's too indiscriminate. I mean, there's a lot of things going on there. And she likes this, right? Unlike you, she's enthusiastic about this. So even when some guy goes in and attacks some immigrant-owned shop, she says, aha, this is, you know, an attack on monopoly, white supremacist capitalism. I just don't buy that. It just seems to me that's a little bit too easy. But I think you're right. I mean, the question here of, you know, property rights and capitalism, this gets much more complicated than I let on. I think Roberto's question now is there, right? Let me see if I can read it.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Well, beautiful. Your English is excellent. It's a long one, so it'll take me a moment.
Are we all able to see the question or
Y está en el chat, María.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a nice
I also
little,
have another question from another colleague of mine, Ernesto Cabrera,
okay.
who wrote to me, and once you answer to Roberto,
Okay.
I have a question for
Roberto wrote a real long one here, so I have to read this. Roberto, I love this. You mentioned that destruction of property often has more harm than good in political practice. In this sense, in what context do you consider that damage to property can have a useful effect? Okay. There are forms of property damage that seek to imbalance or transform state and position, but do you consider there are other politically relevant actions of property destruction? Yeah, I mean, so one of the concerns, I guess other people can read this as well, is that I don't, if the property damage doesn't negatively impact a person, I have no tools to criticize the property damage. That's really interesting. You know, I think you're onto something there. Roberto, I don't know where you are. Maybe you're okay. So, you know, I was thinking about this. So if one were a good Hegelian, right? A good Hegelian believes in this thing called objective spirit. And objective spirit means lots of things, but it might include an argument for statues and monuments as an expression of the spirit of, let's say, you know, a particular people and the level of freedom that has been realized there. So, you know, that would be a sort of argument, unlike mine, that would provide a sturdier basis for, you know, defending, let's say, pushing back against property damage. Yeah, so, I mean, this is the kind of concern I think you have. I think it's a good one. I guess I just don't Well, first of all, I'm not a Hegelian, so that's part of the answer, but that's not a very good one. But I think King is right about this. We just do need to make, so let me put it this way, if you're unhappy with a particular form of property damage and destruction, you have to be able to tell some story about why this is somehow harmful to persons, it seems to me, and maybe that story is going to get more complicated than some of my stories, right? So, maybe you could say, you hear these arguments, I'm sure you hear them in your country, they're in my country, right? So there are a lot of new sort of political symbols that are being established, for example, for kids in minority neighborhoods. They'll have an image of Dr. King, not a Confederate war veteran, on the school wall, right? Now, I have a hard time being convinced by the argument that if somebody comes and vandalizes that this is an attack on the life of the children, okay? Nonetheless, I think you could tell a story which would not be totally disconnected from mine about ways in which this could really be harmful to these kids, all right? And I guess I just don't see the same kind of story making sense if you're talking about a Confederate war veteran whose name nobody knows, except as a group of white supremacists who've just decided suddenly this is important. But I think you're right. I mean, and I'm also just quite honestly struggling with this. I think my argument, the emphasis, this standard of life, which is King's standard. There are places in the paper that I want to kind of extend that a bit because I worry that that's not enough, right? And I think it isn't enough, but I don't want to go too far in extending it because then you sort of lose, I think, the critical bite that his argument offered, which is to say, look, there are just forms of property damage where we see no connection to anybody's, maybe life's the wrong word. I think the way he would put it, he would put this in terms of sort of a modicum of economic and social well-being. How's that? That's kind of the argument. If the statue does not have a relationship to that, then we really shouldn't worry about it. In contrast, right, I'm trying to make sense of this. Having a statue, let's say, of Martin Luther King in a poor African-American or mixed, or for that matter, majority white school, that is something which one could relate potentially to how these kids are going to do economically and socially. So that it has a different status. But I think I'm stumbling. There you go, right? Because I do think you're onto something. I'm not sure how far one can go with this argument. I like what King's saying, but really how far we can go with it is still an open question. Yeah, so thank you. I have to think a lot more about that.
Okay, Bill, I have another question from another person who is following you in Facebook, and he's a professor, but he was a student of ours and a very brilliant one. His name is Ernesto, and I'm going to read the question to you. Recently, there has been an interesting debate in the USA about what is called the right to rescue. Apparently, there is not much disagreement when it is applied, for example, to an act of breaking through a private car to save a pet locked for some reason during a warm day. But there is a big controversy when a right to rescue is used as an activist political weapon against private industrial farmhouse or slaughterhouses. My question is, do you think damaged property politically motivated, as long as it is morally justifiable, can be defended also as a right, as the defenders of the right to rescue try to do it?
Yeah, well, this is what I'm calling disruptive property damage. That's exactly the sort of case that I have in mind. So I would say in principle, yes, right? Nonetheless, people who are doing these sorts of things should, I think, be expected to meet some conditions. So for example, you want to make sure you're not harming some poor fellow who happens to be working in the lab that day, right? There has to be some, the issue of collateral damage, for example. So yes, this is exactly the sort of thing the paper at least opens the door to providing a justification for this. I mean, that may sound like a wishy-washy answer because, of course, as I've been trying to say, our analysis of these cases is always going to depend on the context, right? So I just would want to know more about the particular case before I would say, yes, this sounds like a good idea, but at least given the argument on my paper, there's room for this sort of thing. Very much so. And indeed, a lot of the cases that that Will Smith's work I mentioned, a number of the cases he talks about are precisely these sorts of cases, which are very interesting because this is where you see property damage, politically motivated property damage, animal rights activists who go in and vandalize a laboratory or do something like that, or they destroy the cages to release the animals. Yeah. I'll just add, and to the extent that animals are sentient, these animals are sentient beings, and this is a way to minimize harm to them, my argument also, I think, is in sync with what you're talking about. Thank you.
Anybody else? No? No? This is a wonderful paper and your answers were great. And I think that for us is very enlightening to think that precisely because we've been dealing, as Estela said clearly, with how to cope with what is happening to the feminists, we're really wondering how to understand the activists of today and their relations with justice, which is the kind of normative arguments that you brought us today to this lecture. And thank you so very much.
Maria, thank you. That's very, very kind. I very much appreciated all the questions and comments. As you could tell, I'm still thinking about a number of these things. I'm thinking of doing a little book on this, and it's somewhat provisional. So this was very, very helpful for me in terms of trying to figure out what I will have to explore. So I may come back to you for clarifications at some point. So Maria, thanks so much for having me.
We certainly look forward to having you here in presence, Bill. So I will do my very best to tempt you to come here to give us another lecture. Might be the book you're already trying to work on this subject as well.
Thanks. In that spirit, let's hope COVID goes away. Right?
Yes, yes. Well, muchas gracias a todos, a todas, a mis colegas que nos acompañan hoy y a los alumnos y alumnas que están en presencia de este evento que gracias a Jesús Rodríguez, nuestro director, pudimos tener hoy. Y pues le agradecemos otra vez a Bill haber hecho este esfuerzo por presentarnos este brillante paper que nos deja pensando a todos. Bueno, pues a todas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Bill. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Gracias.